Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. As Kerry said, I'm also an associate editor in the Evidence Production and Methods Directorate. And unfortunately, as Nuala is not well, I'm going to be presenting the slides today. So please do just bear with me, because obviously these aren't my slides, but I will do my very best. Okay, so as associate editors, what we do is we screen reviews before they're published to do a basic quality assurance check on them. And there are three main pillars to our screening, our triage. We look at the implementation of protocol methods, we look at the summary of findings table, and we look at the abstract. So obviously today I'm going to focus on what we look for in a summary of findings table, and also kind of what the common errors are that we often see in summary of findings tables. So what we're basically doing is we're checking the summary of findings tables against the key Messier standards that apply to summary of findings tables. So we look at, does the table present the main outcomes, so the main benefits and harms that you're looking at, and does it present those for the main key comparisons that you're looking at in your review? We look at the PICO part, the PICO section in the summary of findings tables to check that that's accurate and complete. We check that there's enough explanation for the outcomes that you're examining. Is there enough information given about the scale, the time when a measurement was taken, the range of possible scores? Fourthly, we look at the assumed and corresponding risks. So have people appropriately entered the assumed risk and the corresponding risk for that particular comparison and outcome and intervention? We look at your grade ratings. We look at, have you justified them and explained them adequately so that people can work out why you've downgraded or perhaps not downgraded particular outcomes? If you've got narrative results, we look to see if they're clearly and accurately summarized. And we also check that you've presented a grade rating for any narrative results, because people often will not present a grade rating for a narrative result. They perhaps don't think it's necessary if it's not the result of a meta-analysis. Okay, so the first thing we check is, does the soft table, the summary of findings table, present the main outcomes for your main comparisons? And one of the problems that we do find is that people have just got too many summary of findings tables. And I'll explain that a little bit more. Okay, so here you can see a summary of findings table. And as you can see, there's 7 outcomes down in the left-hand column. But if you look, there are actually 8 summary of findings tables in this review. So this one is only one of 8. And the authors have gone through every single comparison they've made. So intervention A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H against placebo. So you've ended up with 8 comparisons and 8 summary of findings tables. So obviously for each summary of findings table, you've got 7 outcomes. And so then you've got kind of 56 outcomes to be summarized in the abstract. Because what we like to see in the abstract is all the outcomes and comparisons that in your summary of findings tables summarized, because those are your key results. And that can be tricky when you're thinking about an abstract, because don't forget, you've got an absolute limit of 1,000 words. And ideally, we'd hope that people would use fewer than 1,000 words. 1,000 words is getting a bit too much for an abstract. You know, it's a limit, not a target, as they say. Okay, so to avoid this error, we recommend that when you actually when you're at the protocol stage of your review, that you think about carefully what your main comparisons and your important outcomes are. So this example, you can see that the authors have pre-specified that there are 4 key comparisons that they want to make. And they've made those comparisons, they've chosen those comparisons based on the opinion of clinical experts. So that's what you should really be looking for in a review, is what do decision makers really want to know? What are the key comparisons? Perhaps, what are the key sort of questions in clinical practice at the minute? And also, they've picked out what they think the main outcomes that they want to include in their summary of findings tables are. And again, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to include all your outcomes in your summary of findings tables, just the key ones. Again, there is, I think the limit is 7 outcomes in a summary of findings tables, but again, that's a limit and not a target. You really want to pick out your key ones. You're trying to basically make sure that decision makers can see the really important information and that they don't get bogged down in too much detail. Yeah, so basically, ensure the focus of the review remains on your most important information. Okay, another common error that we see is that you see the same outcome presented multiple times in the same table. And I'll just show you what I mean here. Okay, so here we've got a summary of findings table, but as you can see, we've got mortality measured twice at 2 different time points, and we've also got quality of life measured twice at the same time point, a year, but in 2 different ways. One is measured with health-related quality of life scales, HRQOL, and they've also added quality of life measured by participant interviews. So yeah, mortality twice, quality of life twice. Yeah, I've got a couple more examples of duplication here. So adverse effects is measured twice, once with RCT evidence and once with evidence from non-randomized studies, NRS. And again, hospital admission, the authors here have reported the overall result, and they've also reported the subgroups, so hospital admission in children and hospital admission in adults. And again, key to avoiding this error is to prioritize at your protocol stage. So it's kind of important to think about what is the follow-up point that your readers, that the decision makers are going to be most interested in, what is most relevant to clinical practice. And so here the authors have decided that the 1-year follow-up is key for mortality. Next, you need to decide what your most appropriate method of measurement is. What is the best way to measure this outcome? What is the most relevant way to measure this outcome? What will be most helpful? And yeah, study design. So when it comes to study designs, we recommend that you either you take the RCT estimate or you take the non-randomized studies estimate, but not both. And what you can do is you can add in your comment column any information about, say, as the authors have done here, the evidence from non-randomized studies. And likewise, subgroups. Yeah, would generally recommend really that you focus on your overall analysis and not your subgroup analysis generally. Although again, you can add something in the comments to say what the subgroup analysis suggested. So here you can see how the authors have written that up when in their protocol. They give priority to objective measures. They're prioritizing evidence from RCTs, and they're prioritizing particular time points. Okay, so another common error is that information is missing or is irrelevant. And this is particularly looking at the PICO section here. So the section sort of towards the top of the soft table, where it talks about your patient population, your settings, your intervention, and your comparator. So as you can see, that PICO is just a little bit vague at the minute. It's not particularly helpful. So here is sort of an improved version. So we're specifying the age, how we're defining adults. We're specifying the setting, it's an outpatient setting, and we're being very clear what the comparator is. It's placebo. And also the quality of life measurement, as you can see, we're more specific about the scale that's used and about the time period of follow-up. Okay, so another common error is presenting the PICO information that you've actually found in your the evidence you've actually found, rather than the PICO that is the question that you want to address. So yeah, we recommend that you present the PICO as it is in the protocol of your review, and not what you've actually found. And there again, yeah, it's present your PICO of interest to your review question. Okay, another thing that we do quite often see is there's missing information in the assumed risk and corresponding risk columns. So the assumed risk is where you show what the risk in the control group was, and the corresponding risk is, what happens with your intervention, what the difference is. And sometimes when a grade table is automatically generated, you get 0 results in particular columns, which is obviously not helpful for decision makers. So what you sometimes have to do there is actually manually populate them. So go in and edit your summary of findings tables there. So as you can see, for the quality of life outcome, there's a comment added to say what an SMD of 0.8 represents, and that generally is considered to represent a large difference between the groups. Obviously, you don't get a mean value for your control group, because SMD is looking at results from different scales, so a mean wouldn't be very meaningful there. The next one about participant satisfaction, that's a mean difference. So there you can indicate what the mean score ranged from. So for example, some studies had a mean in their control group of 1.2, and the sort of the upper limit for that, some study, one or more studies had a limit of 3.4, sorry, mean score of 3.4. And finally, you can see that the reviewers have manually entered the data on adverse effects, and they've taken the data there from the actual meta-analysis to show that there were no events in the control group, and 27 events 27 people with events among 560 participants in the intervention group. So yeah, there's the actual analysis, so you can see where they've got the numbers from to populate those columns. And so that information is just generally more helpful to decision makers than having blanks. Okay, so moving on to grade ratings, we look at the grade ratings in detail. And as you can see from the footnotes here, the authors have got lots of different footnotes, and not necessarily helpful. So, for example, the first footnote says that that random allocation procedures were adequate. However, the risk of bias due to the absence of blinding and the risk of self-selection was high. That doesn't actually tell you have they downgraded that, and what they downgraded it for. Presumably risk of bias. Again, footnote 2 talks about heterogeneity, saying that it's 70%, the I-squared statistic 70%, although no significant, I think that means difference actually was indicated. Again, it doesn't really help you have they downgraded or not. There's all sorts of different, a bit of a mishmash of descriptions in there. what as an editor, what you'd hope authors have done is had a look at chapter 5 of the grade handbook before they start their grade assessment. It's important to remember that judgments are not always clear cut with grade. You know, there's often some room for debate. I think what matters with grade is that you've discussed it with your you've looked at your judgments independently with 2 authors, and also that you've discussed it and you've reached a decision. And so what you need to do is to justify it. So just to make your reasoning robust and transparent, and also try to be consistent with your judgments. And often I think editors will check the grade judgments before the authors begin to write up, because that's quite helpful just to make sure that you've got that consistency and that transparency. Yes, you only need 1 footnote per outcome. You don't need to have multiple footnotes, and you must include so the number of levels you've downgraded something. Have you downgraded it once, or rarely have you downgraded it twice? What grade consideration are you considering when you downgrade? So is it imprecision? Is it risk of bias? And also a brief description of why you've downgraded. So this is looking a lot better, the footnotes now. So what the authors have now done is they've been very clear as to why they've downgraded, and how much they've downgraded, and what reason. So reason 1 is study limitation, so that's risk of bias. And in the second instance, they've downgraded for imprecision because the sample size was very low. And they've also downgraded 2 levels because they considered that the inconsistency or the heterogeneity was very high. There was an I-squared value of 85%. It's also important to make sure that your reasons are consistent across tables. So again, if you've got a very low sample size, that you consistently downgrade for imprecision. Sort of moving towards the last couple of things we check is we look at narrative results, because we, if there is no meta-analysis, it's still important to present the summary of findings, even if it's in a narrative way. And what you shouldn't be doing is presenting your narrative results in your comments column. So we expect people to put the to describe those decisions in the assumed and corresponding risk columns, even though you'll need to merge them. You still want to talk about how many studies you are, and you'll still want to grade it and explain why you've performed a narrative synthesis. Sometimes you kind of get unclear reasons for downgrading, and just generally unclear as to what the authors have done and what the results were. So when you're looking at outcomes like dropouts due to adverse events and serious adverse events, the authors here have said non-reported, but what does that mean? Does that mean that the study authors didn't report this outcome, so it wasn't reported in the trials? Or do they mean that the study authors reported that they did measure adverse events, but that there were no adverse events? So that's very tricky to know what's meant there. So ensure you make a clear distinction between outcome not reported or that no events were recorded. So that's obviously much clearer here, is that it's clear that so for the dropout outcome that it didn't look like the studies reported that, whereas for the serious adverse events outcome, one study did report that, but reported that nobody experienced a serious adverse event in either group. So key learning points. I think hopefully I've sort of emphasised that your protocol is key. Before you even start thinking about doing your review, what are your most important outcomes going to be, and what are your comparisons going to be that you're going to want to present. You want to avoid the situation where you're making post hoc decisions based on, you know, which outcomes have I got the most data for, which is the most interesting result. You need to clearly carry through from your protocol to your review, to your summary of findings table, what are the important things that you need to report. It's not always just an automatic process to create your table. You'll need to double check it, and you might need to tweak it as necessary. And yeah, grade is an art, perhaps not a science. You know, there can be some subjective decision making, and that's where discussions between authors are really valuable. And as long as you explain it in your footnotes, well, and as long as it's a reasonable explanation, then that's okay.